Right, hello. We should be live, and we should be getting on with some A-level politics. Let's have a look and make sure we're live. Hang on. There we go. Brilliant. Right. So, welcome to the third, I believe, of this year for A-level politics. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about the judiciary in this lesson. And we're going to talk specifically about looking at some exam questions. We're going to look at three main exam questions in this stream. For those who want to rewatch the stream when it's done, it'll be up, available live. And also for those who just want the individual lessons, we'll be uploading them as well as individual videos too. So you'll be able to catch up on any of this if you don't have time to watch it now. So, and again, if anybody has any questions at any point, just put them in the chat box. And if anybody has any suggestions for examples or arguments to be made for each exam question, then you can throw that in the chat as well. So we're just going to start very quickly. We're going to begin with the first exam question. So the first question is this, and it is a simple short answer question. It is asking us to explain judicial review and its importance. So again, because it's a short answer question, it means we don't have to worry about providing any kind of arguments or political debates, or on the one hand, on the other hand, we are simply asked a very a basic question, and we are asked to just simply explain what judicial review is, and explain why it is important. Explain the importance of judicial review for studying politics, effectively. So, because it's asking us two things, effectively, we're being asked two things. We're asked, firstly, to explain judicial review. That's the first half of this question. And the second half of this question is we have to explain the importance of judicial review. So we can almost split it into two, and you could probably do two paragraphs for this question. Okay, so let's begin with the first of these paragraphs, and that is simply to explain judicial review. Now, before I go and put any points down, does anybody have any definition or any way that they would explain what judicial review is? Can anybody think of how they would explain judicial review? If not, we'll talk about this, we'll go through it individually on each section. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about explaining what judicial review is, and then explaining its importance. Okay? Nope. Okay. So let's think about how we would explain judicial review. Explain what it is. If you were explaining it to somebody who didn't know. Well, we would say that it is a judicial process, of course, and it's a judicial process that examines whether a public body has operated beyond its powers. That's effectively the most simple definition that we can think of. And if we want to get some key words in, we could say that a public body has acted ultra vires, beyond their powers, and that is effectively the definition of what judicial review is. But we can go further than that. You can go further than that. You can't just simply write the definition. You have to explain it in a little bit more detail, and we can talk about when judicial review can occur. So, for example, it can occur where there is an alleged unequal treatment, unfair treatment, miscarriage of natural justice, for example, and also things like on the rule of law, and we can talk about Human Rights Act and how judicial review can be triggered through those means as well. These are all the different ways in which we can explain what judicial review is. Okay, and is there anything else that anybody would think about if we're talking about judicial review? Is there anything else anybody would bring up as a reference to explaining judicial review? Can anybody think of anything else that can be explained through judicial review? And while people are going through and looking at that, I'm just going to write the question out in the chat, just so people know what we're doing. So that is the exam question right here. Like so. So that's the first half of the question. Very simple, very easy. We're given a bit of a definition. We're using some key terms. We're talking about ultra vires, beyond one's powers. And we can also talk about when judicial review occurs. Okay. If you put these 3 points into a paragraph, and talk a little bit about where and when a judicial review occurs, the importance of the kinds of public bodies that it applies to, okay, and then explain what ultra vires refers to within the context of judicial review. That is a simple explanation for judicial review. The next part would be to explain judicial review and its importance, to explain the importance of judicial review. So you wouldn't get very many marks if we just simply explained what judicial review was. You'd have to go a little bit deeper and explain why it is important, explain the importance of judicial review. And there are a number of points you can make for why judicial review is important. You could talk a little bit about how it is able to prevent the government from operating in a way that is arbitrary or ultra vires, beyond one's powers. So we can say how it performs and acts as really a check on the government. It's a check on government authority. It stops and it prevents the government from acting in any kind of arbitrary way. And again, it can also prevent the government from acting ultra vires, from acting beyond one's means. So that's one point that we could make. Okay, let me just make sure we got everything going on here. Perfect. Next point is we could say that it can also protect the rule of law. Okay, and this is something that's important. You could explain what the rule of law is, so you can talk about what the rule of law actually means, and then we can then talk about how it can protect the rule of law. Okay, and that's why that is important. It's important because it is able to protect the rule of law. And we can also talk about review based on the Human Rights Act and how we can protect individual rights and civil liberties through the process of judicial review. And if you were really looking for some top marks, and if you had the ability to do so, you could maybe even provide some case law around this example here. If anybody wants to link and reference some case law in the chat that you could use as an example of judicial review preventing a public body from acting in an arbitrary way, then anyone can do so. That would be very useful for people. But this is a simple way in which we can explain judicial review and explain its importance, and that's effectively the question. A further point is that we could say that it is important in its ability to subject all public bodies. So any public body or organisation that is involved in any kind of public business, so business that is that is not private, not like in the private sector, like private businesses, may be subject to judicial review based on all the above principles. Now, this could fit in the section on why it's important, or it can fit in the section of what judicial review is, and in explaining what judicial review is. You can fit that in either of them there. And so these are the points that you can make for explaining judicial review. If there are any other points anybody wants to make, leave them in the chat and I'll come back to them when we look at the next question. So I'm just going to give a couple of minutes and then we're going to go to the next question. Okay, just reading some bits here, sorry. Right, okay. So let's think about the next question. Like I've said, we're going to do two short answer questions, and then we're going to do one long answer question, and that's what we're going to look at in this lesson. So the first question we've looked at was explain judicial review and its importance, and in the next lesson, in the next section, we're going to talk about the next question. And the next question again is referring to the judiciary. It is also a short answer question, and we are asked here to explain how the independence of the judiciary is guaranteed. Okay, now again, this is a short answer question, so we don't have to make arguments to and from. We don't have to talk about political discussion. We don't really have to, have a debate, the pros and cons of whatever. We just have to explain the ways in which judicial independence is guaranteed. It's a very simple thing, and it's a very easy way of doing it, because all we're going to do is we're just going to list a number of ways in which judicial independence is ensured, in which we have judicial independence in the UK. So, can anybody think of any reasons why or how judicial independence is guaranteed before we start? If not, we can talk straight away about the first one. So again, what we need to do is define what we mean when we talk about judicial independence, and then we have to explain how this is guaranteed. So that's something that was referenced quite strongly at the start in the mark scheme for this question, and they said that you should be able to talk about what judicial independence is and what we mean by judicial independence before we then go on to explain how it is guaranteed. So let's talk first about defining judicial independence. So how would we define what judicial independence is? Well, simply, judicial independence means free from influence from government, parliament, political associations, the media, etc., etc. So when we say they are independent, we mean that they are they are independent from a particular thing, that particular thing being influence from government. They are free from any kind of influence from parliament or any other kind of political institutions or political associations. And they're also independent from the media. Okay, so that is what we mean when we're talking about judicial independence. Now let's talk about how we can guarantee judicial independence. What do we mean, and how it is? What things can we reference to talk about how it is guaranteed? So the first points we could talk about is the role of the Lord Chancellor. Don't forget, with the impact of the Constitutional Reform Act from 2005, we have had a new Lord Chancellor in terms of their role. So the Lord Chancellor originally was somebody who would sit in all three branches of government. So they sat in the House of Lords. They had a significant role when it came to the judiciary, and they also had a significant role when it came to the executive. Now, today, with the passing of the Constitutional Reform Act from 2005, we have seen a changing of the role of the Lord Chancellor. The Lord Chancellor's role has changed and been reformed somewhat, and this reform means that it is ensuring a greater separation of powers between the judiciary, parliament, and the government. So this is a way in which the government and parliament are now no longer able to influence the judiciary, in the sense that they cannot do so through the role of the Lord Chancellor. And this is something that we can talk about with this, and you can reference the Constitutional Reform Act. Another example, again coming from the Constitutional Reform Act from 2005, is the establishment of the Supreme Court. The establishment of the Supreme Court created a separation of powers between Parliament and government and the judiciary. It moved the law lords, the highest court in the land, originally sitting in the House of Lords, and we moved them to a new Supreme Court, which was established in 2009. And again, this is something that came from the Constitutional Reform Act 2005. And it's just a way of showing that Parliament and government cannot influence the judiciary in the same way in which it may have been perceived to have been the case when they sat in the House of Lords. It seemed quite strange for the members of the law lords, a member of the House of Lords, to be adjudicating and performing judicial action on legislation that was passed in the very same building that they were doing this from, and the very same institution, the House of Lords. So we have the creation and the establishment of the Supreme Court in 2009. Another example is the establishment of the Judicial Appointments Commission. This is something that has guaranteed judicial appointments are done on a non-political basis. So unlike, for example, the United States and the system that they have, we do not have a system where we have politicians appointing the judiciary. We have an example whereby the Judicial Appointments Commission does this, and the process for the Supreme Court justices are slightly different. It requires the influence of the President of the Supreme Court as well. But again, all of these processes of appointment, none of them are political in nature. So that's a good example of how we can ensure that there is no interference from Parliament and government, and that how we have independence from the judiciary. We have the Judicial Appointments Commission. Judges are also guaranteed security of tenure. Okay, now this is something that's important. It means that judges can't just be fired for no, out of any kind of particular reason. They all have to retire at a certain age, especially Supreme Court justices. I believe the age is 65, which is arguably quite a minimum age for retiring from the Supreme Court, especially when a lot of them are quite old when they came into the Supreme Court. But anyway, you have a security of tenure. Now you have to, rather than just listing all of these points, you have to also ensure that you are able to explain how these points are able to ensure that we have a guaranteed judicial independence. Okay, so it's not enough to just say judges are guaranteed security of tenure, but why does that ensure that judicial independence is guaranteed? Why does the security of tenure allow for the judiciary to be independent? Well, we know that because of security of tenure, there is no risk of Parliament or government or any kind of outside institution, outside factor. There's no risk of them being able to influence, bribe, or threaten any kind of judge on the basis of their tenure, because it is secured, and therefore they cannot. That's one of the ways, a pressure point, if you will, that they can't focus on and they can't attack when it comes to the judiciary. We also have the guarantee of future income for judges. Again, this is something that you can list and you can make note of, but you also have to explain how this ensures that the judiciary has independence. And again, this is quite easy to do. If you are guaranteed an income when you're on the bench, and also when you retire, you're guaranteed a good pension or whatever. It shows that it prevents any kind of outside institution, again, Parliament, government, media, any kind of other political association. It prevents any of them from being able to influence, bribe, anything like that, or again threaten the income of a judge on the basis of a decision that they may make. So this is another example of how judicial independence is guaranteed. So that's the second question. So we've done two so far, quite quickly actually. We've done two so far in less than 25 minutes, and mainly because these are both quite short questions. If anybody wants to ask any questions or make any comments, then let me know. If not, we will move on to the next question very shortly. So just picking this back up. Okay. So let's think about the final question that we're going through today. And again, I will mention this at the start of all of these questions. Okay. The final question. Again, all of these lessons will be published as a 1B live stream later on, but then also in the future, I'll publish each of these questions individually, and so that will allow people to pick and choose which question they want to do, rather than having to scroll through an entire live stream. So that's been the case, and that's what we've been doing recently anyway. So let's think about the next question. Now, this question is a longer question. It will be a 40, 45 mark question, or even a 25 mark question, okay? And we're going to ask the question, to what extent can judges check the power of the executive and the legislature? Okay? So we're talking about a checks and balances question, if you will, a separation of powers kind of question. And really we're asking not just about the executive but also the legislature, so we have to focus on both. Now that's quite a good thing, because it means that we have a lot more freedom in the kinds of things we can talk about. Because if it was just to what extent can judges check the power of the executive, or to what extent can judges check the power of the legislature, then we might be a bit more limited in the things we can talk about. However, there are a lot of cross-cutting issues that we can focus on. So again, a longer based essay question, quite simple. We have to develop some for and against arguments and have a much deeper political discussion. So in the previous two, it was just about using our knowledge and being able to explain concepts and being able to explain and expand upon concepts using some examples as well. In this one, we have to write a proper essay. We have to write a big, long form, a lot more stylized essay. Okay. Now I'm also going to think about writing some essays myself and putting them on a video and going through exactly why these essays are very good and very bad. If anybody wants that, then let me know. I think that could be a useful way of deconstructing like a level 5 essay and being able to focus and hone in on some of the really important aspects of it. So let's think about this question. To what extent can judges check the power of the executive and the legislature? We are given a debate that has two sides. Okay, there are two sides to this debate. We are asked, on the one hand, that judges can check the power of the executive and the legislature in a significant or meaningful way. And then on the other hand, the other side of that argument is that they cannot, or they don't significantly check the power of the executive or the legislature. So they're the two sides of the argument. Now, if you want to get that top level marks, if you want to get those top level marks, whether this be a 25 mark question or a 40 mark question, depending on the exam board that you're in, if you want to get those really high marks, those A and A stars, then I would personally always recommend that you come to a conclusion on one side or the other of this question. It's better to do that than to just sit on the fence and go on the one hand this and on the other hand that. It's better to go and in your introduction introduce what your argument is going to be, and then go through, prove your argument, show your argument, develop your argument in the essay, but then also attack your own argument by looking at the other side, looking at the counterpoints, but then attack those counterpoints and explain why those counterpoints are wrong, or are they're insufficient, or they're meaningless, etc., etc. And then that can bring us back to the original argument and say we have shown this to be the case, if that makes sense. Okay, so there are two sides of this debate that you have to have. To what extent can judges check the power of the executive and the legislature? We have to think about ways in which the judges can check the power of the executive and the legislature. There are a few points that you can make for this. There are a few arguments, there are a few debates you can have. What I'm going to do is list the points that you can make. I'm not going to go into too much detail as to providing examples for each of these things. That's something that you should be able to think about yourself and go and research on your own time. And you can then, if you want to, write this essay out using the points that I've made, but also with your own evidence, with your own examples. Okay, so the first point is a more theoretical point. This being that the courts are the guardians of the rule of law. Now, this is an aspect where you'll probably have to explain what the rule of law is if you're going to make this argument. Okay, so the rule of law is defined as the authority and influence of law in society, especially when viewed as a constraint on individual and institutional behaviour. Okay, and it is therefore the principle whereby all members of society are considered equally subject to publicly disclosed legal codes and processes. Now that's the Oxford English Dictionary's definition, and is basically referring to the concept of equality under the law. It is also talking about how we should be able to ensure the rule of law, to be able to promote the rule of law in cases where there is a constraint on the individual or institutional liberties of individuals. Okay, so that's what we mean when we talk about the rule of law, the idea of equality before the law. Everybody is equal under the law, and therefore therefore people should be treated equally under the law. This is something that the judges can do. Now, if I was to give some guidance as to the kind of evidence that you should use to try and provide some support for this argument that they are the guardians of the rule of law, you could talk about the ways in which the executive and the legislature in the past have been able to prevent some quite fundamental civil and political rights of individuals, and that the courts have been able to prevent. Now, this would tie into the Human Rights Act and human rights more generally, but if you want to think about the post 9/11 and the post 7/7 bombings terrorism orders and restraining orders and things that were put in place by the government for suspected terrorists, those who were not charged, okay, this is an example of how these people were not treated equally under the law. The executive and the legislature effectively have broken the rule of law in these examples, and the judges have come in and they have said, no, you cannot do this. You have acted ultra vires, you have acted beyond your means, and we are going to protect the rule of law by protecting these individuals. Now, that's an example of how the courts can be seen as guardians of rule of law, but you could also use these examples and these particular cases when we are talking about specifically the Human Rights Act, which will be another point. Okay. The second point we could talk about is that the judicial review, something we looked at earlier on in the stream or in a previous video, if you're watching this on video afterwards, judicial review can prevent the exercise of arbitrary power, ultra vires issues, and unfair and equal treatment of citizens. Again, this ties into the rule of law aspect, the concept of the rule of law. Effectively, we're going to be talking about the rule of law for the whole essay. However, we can, and we can tie this into the first point, because we can say that judicial review is a tool that can be used by judges and has been used by judges, and is able to prevent any kind of arbitrary power, any kind of ultra vires decision, any kind of unfair and unequal treatment of citizens by the executive and the legislature. Those are ways in which we can check the executive and the legislature in that regard. The third point that you can make quite easily is obviously when it comes to referencing the Human Rights Act. Okay, the Human Rights Act enables the judiciary to strike down executive acts which offend human rights, which are incompatible with the act of legislation that is the Human Rights Act. Okay, now if you're going to talk about some case law, there's plenty of case law, again referring to a number of aspects of the Human Rights Act, but specifically we can talk about the extent to which the human rights of suspected terrorists were violated in the early 2000s when it came to the terrorism legislation that was enacted post 9/11 and post the 7/7 bombings. So again, you can use the same examples from the first point when we talk about the rule of law to apply to the Human Rights Act. If you're not talking about the Human Rights Act in this question, then I think there's something wrong, because that is the easiest slam dunk point. I think every single examiner who is reading an essay on this question will expect you to write about the Human Rights Act. If you feel like you don't want to write about the Human Rights Act for some reason, then be my guest. But if you want to write about the Human Rights Act, that is the easiest point you can make. The final one relates tangentially to the Human Rights Act, and this is the issue of declarations of incompatibility when we're talking about legislation that is incompatible with the European Court of Human Rights and the European Convention on Human Rights. So the ECHR the European Convention of Human Rights is a piece of international law. It's an international treaty. Okay, it is part of our commitments to being a member of the Council of Europe, something that we did in the 1950s. I think it should be noted as well that the Council of Europe is not the same as the anything to do with the European Union. So we haven't left the Council of Europe. This is something that a number of my EU law students have coming to having to reconcile with. The idea is that the Council of Europe is entirely separate and completely different in every single way to the European Union. Okay, it's a bit confusing, but that's the case. And the Council of Europe, to be part of the Council of Europe, you also have to be a party to the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, I'm going to take this opportunity very quickly to explain how international law and international treaties like the European Convention on Human Rights interacts with the principle of parliamentary sovereignty that we have in the United Kingdom, because this is something that for A level you won't have to be expected to know this, but it is something that can actually be very useful in being able to explain these things in a little bit more detail, because I feel like if people don't understand the ways in which international law relates to the principle of parliamentary sovereignty, then it can be difficult for people to reconcile all of these ideas, and it can confuse people. So just knowing this will have a better understanding. Okay, so when it comes to international law, okay, we have a number of different sources that exist when it comes to international law. Oops. Have we got an error? Hang on. Is everything okay? Are we still streaming? I think so. Hang on. Oh yeah, we're still streaming. Sorry. Anyway, so my stream decided it wanted to error for some reason. Anyway, so we're talking about... Okay, so we're talking about international law, okay? When we talk about the sources of international law, the kinds of things that exist in international law, we have a number of different examples. So there are things such as general principles of international law, so general rules that countries have to follow. We also have things such as customary international law, general custom, which again is something that we don't need to go into for A level. But we also have treaties. So treaties are almost like contracts that are signed by states. There are agreements between either two states or multiple states to uphold a number of different things. And there are lots of different treaties that exist. The Geneva Conventions, for example, are treaties. There are lots of treaties under the World Trade Organization, etc., etc. The European Convention on Human Rights is also a treaty. Okay. And because the United Kingdom has signed up to the European Convention of Human Rights, we are bound to all of the rules under international law. But this does not mean that we are bound to the rules under domestic jurisdiction. So, a treaty, an international treaty, like the European Convention on Human Rights, will only apply domestically in the United Kingdom if there has been a piece of legislation that has been passed by Parliament. Now, that's something that's very important, okay? So, for example, the European Convention of Human Rights applied, okay, to the United Kingdom under international law from the second that we ratified it as a treaty in the 1950s. But it never, all of the things within the ECHR never actually applied to... in a domestic sense to the UK's jurisdiction until we had the passage of the Human Rights Act, until Parliament came in and passed the Human Rights Act. So that meant that before the Human Rights Act, everybody had to, if you wanted to make a human rights claim to the ECHR, you would have to go to Strasbourg and you'd have to make that claim. And they will be binding under international law. It would not be binding under domestic law. That's the distinction that needs to be made. So when we get the Human Rights Act actually takes all of the things, or most of the things, from the European Convention on Human Rights, and it puts it into UK domestic law. And that's how the relationship between parliamentary sovereignty and international law works. I hope that makes sense for everybody. If anybody's got any questions on that, do let me know. Now let's finish off this stream by talking about the opposite side of the argument, the extent to which we have limits on judicial power. So what are the limits that can be thought of when it comes to judicial power? Okay. Well, any time we talk about judicial power and the relationship between the judiciary and the executive and the legislature, we have to think about parliamentary sovereignty. Okay? So the judiciary cannot set aside primary legislation that is passed by Westminster. So that government ministers and Parliament can actually circumvent the European Convention on Human Rights because they can just pass primary legislation to do so. Okay? Now, this is something that is very important because Parliament is sovereign when it comes to lawmaking. Okay? If Parliament wants to repeal the Human Rights Act tomorrow, if they wanted to, they could do so. They have got no obligation to uphold the Human Rights Act and to therefore uphold the ECHR under domestic law. Okay, they could do that tomorrow. They could set aside the Human Rights Act and they could say, well, actually, we're not going to follow it. We're going to get rid of it. We're going to make our own new Human Rights Act. Okay, and they could do that, and the judiciary would have no way of challenging that because the judiciary is beholden to the pieces of legislation that are passed by Parliament. So they interpret the laws by Parliament. They do not override anything that Parliament does because there is no higher authority than Parliament and parliamentary sovereignty. If we compare this to the United States, where the most sovereign, the highest authority in the United States is the US Constitution, in the United States, the judiciary can override legislation that's passed by Congress because they can say, well, actually, this legislation is not compatible with the US Constitution. The US Constitution is the highest law in the United States. Well, we don't have that in the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, we have parliamentary sovereignty, and that's it. And that's all we have. So that's one of the ways in which we can limit judicial power, and ways that judicial power is limited. A second one is that the judiciary cannot be proactive. They have to wait for a case to come to them before they can act and make any decisions. So let's think of the example of the Gina Miller case, the second Gina Miller case, when it came to the prorogation of Parliament. The Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal in Scotland and in England and Wales, okay, they only adjudicated on the issue of the prorogation of Parliament because there were people that brought those cases to the court system. Okay, Gina Miller being an example of one of them. The Supreme Court, if nobody had brought any cases to the judiciary when it came to the prorogation of Parliament, then Parliament would have prorogued just like how Boris Johnson wanted it to, and they would have got Brexit through however they wanted it to, etc., etc., etc. The Supreme Court has no authority to go and proactively bring a case to itself. It has to sit there and it has to wait for people to bring cases to it. So that's ways in which judicial power is limited. A judge cannot check the power of the executive and the legislature if nobody brings a complaint to them. Okay, if there are no complainants in a case, then they can't do that. Okay, so they can't be proactive. That's an example of a limit to judicial power. Another example is that they cannot strike down executive action. Okay, we have to think about the comparison between parliamentary sovereignty and the judiciary. Okay, and they can't strike down legislative action either. Don't forget. Okay, so if an act of parliament is passed, then that act of parliament cannot be questioned by any judicial authority. It can be interpreted by a judicial authority, and there's been plenty of cases where An Act of Parliament was passed, okay, and maybe one or two bits of the language were quite vague, and the judiciary interpreted it in a way that Parliament probably didn't expect, and probably Parliament didn't want, but that was a result that Parliament got because that's how the law was interpreted. That's how the judiciary can interpret. It can interpret legislation passed by Parliament, but it can't strike it down. And so those are the ways in which we can think about how we can think about the limits to judicial power. Are there any more questions before we finish with this exam question? Are there any more questions before we finish? If there are no more questions, then I'd like to thank everybody who was live watching the live stream. I'd like to thank everybody who watches this on playback when it gets published later today, and I'd like to thank everybody who watches these individual lessons too. Next week, actually tomorrow, we're going to do an A-level history live stream. So if you are somebody who is studying A-level history, if you're studying the Germany topic for A-level history, it doesn't actually matter which A-level history you're doing, OCR, AQA, EdXL. We're going to be talking about Nazi Germany specifically. So if you're studying that topic, we're going to talk about some exam questions for that. So if you're studying that, then be sure to tune in tomorrow at the same time at 4 o'clock. And then next week, we're going to move on to look at democracy and participation for the United Kingdom. And then we're going to move on to talk about elections, political parties, pressure groups in the later weeks. And probably actually in the new year as well. So thank you everybody for tuning in, and I will see you all either tomorrow or next week.